40 years ago this month, an American president took a risk, bringing together the leaders of two historic, bitter enemies for a high-stakes mission. Failure could have meant war, and yet Jimmy Carter and his team orchestrated an enduring agreement, the Camp David Accords, a successful first step for a region that is still in need of brave diplomats like the ones back in 1978. War after war after war. In the middle of the last century, Egypt and Israel spent decades fighting over territory and security. In 1978, Jimmy Carter, an evangelical Christian and second-year president, put his prestige on the line.
A framework for peace in the Middle East.
Carter wrote long and personal letters to the Israeli and Egyptian heads of state, begging the enemies to come to America and talk.
The challenge is tremendous.
They agreed, setting the stage for a negotiation at the president's wilderness residence, Camp David.
At Camp David on a Maryland mountaintop.
Almost never in our history has a president devoted so much time on a single problem.
Carter studied psychological profiles of the men prepared by the CIA and State Department.
Prime Minister Begin of Israel.
Menachem Begin, a conservative who led a militant group at the nation's outset, had a loose grip on power.
President Sadat of Egypt.
Anwar Sadat, described by the CIA as a former revolutionary and ardent nationalist, known for his realism, political acumen, and capacity for surprising, courageous, and dramatic decisions. With two fierce adversaries, my father, National Security Advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski, advised the president, "You will have to control the proceedings from the outset." Carter did just that.
At the request of President Carter, Begin is making no political statements.
Negotiating with each other and not through the press.
I said no interviews today. After Camp David.
Carter's clampdown made what was happening inside a mystery to most reporters.
Next to nothing of what they have said has got outside Camp David's barbed wire fences.
The Israeli delegation is totally zipped up. Even less is coming out of it than is coming out of the Egyptian delegation.
Well, all the indications are that something's up, but we don't know just what.
Even Carter had no idea how long the talks would last, nor did Begin or Sadat agree on what was to come of them. Sadat wanted Israeli troops out of the Sinai Peninsula and rights for Palestinians. Begin wanted simply to agree on principles for future negotiations.
Begin and Sadat were so completely and personally incompatible, they couldn't even be in the same room without exploding in anger. So I kept them apart. They never saw each other for 10 days.
As Carter and his team socialized with the leaders, each side got a better appreciation of what the other wanted. They played, talked, ate together, and prayed.
President Sadat of Egypt attended a Friday Muslim service at Camp David. The Jewish Sabbath began at sundown, which means Prime Minister Begin won't be working on temporal affairs, and President Carter will attend Baptist services at Camp David on Sunday morning.
Dozens of American, Israeli, and Egyptian staffers and family members roamed Camp David's grounds. I was there with the president's daughter, Amy. But diplomacy is no picnic, even though it looked like it at times.
Now, as the summit begins its second week,
the advances made thus far might just simply evaporate.
The talks stalled over the dismantling of Israeli settlements. They needed a break. Carter brought them to Gettysburg to see a place where two sides would kill each other by the thousands and then ultimately reconcile to live in peace.
The three leaders were relaxed and jovial, seeming to confirm reports from inside Camp David that the informal atmosphere there had brought them all closer together.
On the brink of failure, Carter approached Begin with a photograph, which he inscribed with love to each of the Israeli prime minister's grandchildren. Begin was so moved by the gesture that he said they would try one more time.
The scene in the White House last night was almost unbelievable.
The resulting deal removed Israeli troops from Sinai, ended hostilities, and opened the Suez Canal to the Israelis.
The risks were high, but so was your determination.
Let us promise each other that we shall do it earlier than between 3 months.
The peace treaty between the countries would not be signed for another 6 months.
Documents ending a 30-year state of war between Israel and Egypt.
The photo op was the finale, not the beginning. A time when American leadership and hard-fought diplomacy led to an historic breakthrough on the world stage.
Without any exaggeration, what he did constitutes one of the greatest achievements of our time.
In the face of adversity and hostility, you have demonstrated the human value that can change history.
What a remarkable piece of history, and what a lesson to all of us still today. Let's bring in right now the 39th President of the United States, President Jimmy Carter. And Mr. President, 40 years later, still no ground war in the Middle East. That's extraordinary in itself, but what do you believe are the greatest achievements of that time and the legacy of the Camp David Accords?
Well, thank you, Joe. This morning, it's good to remember this 40 years ago, what happened. As a matter of fact, not a single word of a treaty between Israel and Egypt has been violated during that 40 years. They still had peace, although before Camp David agreement between Israel and Egypt, they had been at war 3 times against each other and despised each other still because they could remember things that happened in the war and the people that had been killed on both sides. So it's very gratifying to me to remember back in those days, and I hope that they'll continue to be at peace. But there were 2 basic elements of the Camp David Accords. One was a peace treaty between Israel and Egypt. It took about 6 months more negotiation between the 2, in which I was deeply involved, of course. The other part was to give the Palestinians full autonomy, that is, to manage their own affairs, and ultimately we hope to have a nation of their own. That hasn't been realized, but I think the overall result of the Camp David Accords has been very beneficial to both sides.
Mr. President, we could talk about the problems that the United States is struggling through right now, especially on the world stage. But it seems to me, focusing on what you did not only with the Camp David Accords, but also we're going to be celebrating the 40th anniversary of your opening with China. Talk about how you did what you did at Camp David, something that was seen as remarkable even then, but even more so 40 years later. The patience, the preparation, your own unique personal skills that kept these 2 bitter enemies together, talking even through the toughest of time. What do you say to young men and women that are listening this morning about what was required by you to make this happen?
Well, in my inaugural address and throughout my term as president, I tried to do 2 things. One is promote peace, and the other was to be a champion of human rights on behalf of our country. And I think that living in peace is one of the basic human rights of all human beings. So in addition to the treaty between Israel and Egypt, I tried to promote peace with all other nations in the world, and we were pretty well successful in dealing with China as well. I negotiated during the same year, that is 1978, with Deng Xiaoping, and toward the end of that year, we announced the agreement that would establish peace between our 2 countries for the first time in more than 35 years. I think of all the things that I did as president, the normalization of relations with China was perhaps the most long-time effect on world affairs, because China did 2 things as delineated by Deng Xiaoping then. One was reform internally, and also reach out to other nations around the world. So China has now become a very major factor in international affairs, and you know what's happened since they had free enterprise in China beginning a year after we had the agreement. So since 1979, China has never been at war with any other country. So peace has prevailed in the Far East around the Pacific Ocean since that time, although we had earlier been afflicted with the Vietnam War, the Korean War, and constant war. So I think that was a success as well in bringing peace to the world. And I hope that we can maintain that peace and get along with our, former enemies, that is, between Israel and Egypt, and also between the United States and China.
And Mr. President, looking at the challenges that you faced in Camp David, you had to deal with Menachem Begin, Anwar Sadat, and also Zbig.
Oh, boy.
Which I understand can be a challenge. So what was that like?
Well, dealing with Brzezinski was always a very wonderful experience for me. He was completely loyal. He was very knowledgeable, and he was a driving force. He was one of the main ones who worked directly with me, along with Cy Vance, to let me know what both sides wanted. After the third day at Camp David, we had 13 days in all. As you said earlier, I never let the two get together, Begin and Sadat. So I would go back and forth while Begin was asleep. I would talk to Sadat, and while Sadat was asleep, I would talk to Begin. So I didn't get much sleep. I think I lost about 15 pounds while I was at Camp David in the 13 days. And but it was through people like Brzezinski who let me know what both sides wanted, and so I could try to accommodate them.
What do you want for the Middle East over the next 40 years, Mr. President?
Well, I want Israel and Egypt to stay at peace with each other. That's a key to the whole region. But I also want the Palestinians to have a chance to live a full and fruitful and enjoyable life. So that was one of the agreements that Begin finally accepted. And of course, we could see indications even after we got back to Washington, before the two leaders went home, that the Israelis were going to back down on the Palestinian issue. So I hope that we can see my dream for that region come true, and that is for Israel to live at peace with all its neighbors, so that the Israelis and Palestinians and Egyptians and also, hopefully, in the future, the Syrians and others can have a peaceful existence.
President Jimmy Carter, so great to hear from you. Thank you very much for being on this morning.
Thank you, Mick. I've always been thankful for your father's role that he played at Camp David.
Me too. Thank you very much. And our thanks to the Jimmy Carter Library and Museum for their help in sharing some of that rare footage. It definitely brings back memories.
I just wanted to say to John Heilman, you sit, or Mika, even, you sit there and you look at the patience that President Carter showed. You look at the persistence that he showed. And also, even before going there, the preparation that he showed in getting to know the men that he was going to be dealing with. That is something that this White House, and that is something that every White House should take to heart when trying to strike a deal or trying to understand either the Chinese or the North Koreans or the Israelis, the Palestinians. These diplomatic breakthroughs don't just happen because you call a meeting. This was extraordinarily difficult, and that's the only way things happen.
It was incredible.
I think what we just saw, what we just talked about, Camp David, that is a blueprint for future leaders to understand how to make things change for the better on the world stage.
My daughter did a paper on the Camp David Accords and interviewed my father right before he passed away. And to hear about the preparation, the psychological preparation alone, it was incredible. And then to be a kid of someone who was a part of that process, I'm just sorry I was such a jerk. I was 11, and I just, you don't know what your parents are doing. And wow, that was an incredible effort on the part of President Carter and his team.
Well, the one thing, talking about your behavior there, the one thing that President Carter has spoken about in the past but did not speak about today was the fact that you almost sidetracked
Yeah, I know.
the entire process by almost running over Manak and Begin with the golf cart.
What were we doing there? What were we doing there?
And what exactly were you doing almost running over Manak and Begin in a golf cart?
You know what? From that important moment in history, next we turn back to what's happening today in Washington and the world. We'll be right back with much more Morning Joe.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.